When I first saw Natalia, all I could picture was Georgia. The way her skin melted off her face, the smell of her hair burning and the sound that she made. I didn't have time to count, but there were more than I originally thought. I figured these must have been the 15 people Prudence talked about, entering the flats that burned before it happened. I already knew that Natalia was one of them. Eddie and Ellie clutched Terry's skirt, trembling with fear. I wanted to help protect them, but I still couldn't help but tremble a little myself every time I caught a glimpse of those hollow voids where their eyes were. "Hi, Terry," the kids asked. "Could we borrow some sugar?" She asked menacingly, grinning at the frightened family stood next to me. After a moment or two of intense staring, Natalia finally addressed me. She appeared to be the spokesperson for the group. "How's your friend doing? It was a shame we had to end our visit. I was enjoying her company." "Don't speak about her. She's got nothing to do with you. You sick bitch," I screamed at her. I couldn't bear looking at her face again. "You don't scare me with all your freak friends. I'm not going to let you hurt this lady or her kids." Natalia chuckled. I gulped. I may talk a good game, but I am no hero. Mere days ago, I was just a young girl excited to move in with her boyfriend, and now here I am. My boyfriend's dead, my flat is like living in my own personal horror movie, and I'm standing up challenging demonic flame neighbors to defend demonic-looking children. But when I said she didn't scare me, I meant it. Something inside me was eradicating any fear of these people. I just wanted to protect the residents. Life really does throw curveballs. "I know you aren't scared. I saw it in your eyes when you stuck that big knife in my throat. That's why we're here. My brothers and sisters are not freaks. You're the freaks, thinking that your lives have meaning. We watch you people go about your day-to-day lives and your mundane routines, and nothing really changes. Your lives are pointless and disposable. That's why we set the fire. All those years ago," she chuckled throughout her words. There was an animation in them, like she was a psychotic cartoon character, finally catching its prey after 138 episodes of chasing. "Those people weren't disposable," Terry mumbled, barely a decibel higher than a whisper. "What was that, Terry? Did you have something to say?" Natalia went from psychotic cartoon to school bully. She made my skin crawl. "I was only a child, but those people were friends of my parents. They were good people," Terry said with slightly more confidence. None of the other people had moved. They just stood there staring. "Why would you burn people alive? What can you possibly gain?" I interjected, taking a slight step between Natalia and Terry and the kids. I could see she was getting ready to go for them, and I couldn't let it happen. "We were living with the great leader, Michael. All of us. Living in the righteous manner that he had directed us to live," she gestured to the people around her. The name Michael appeared to inspire some sort of emotion in the group. "Michael's brother Jonathan lived here, on the floor we burned. He let us hang out there sometimes, but he didn't live the righteous way that we did. He didn't like our beliefs. But he took us in when we lost the place we were staying because of the growth of the group. Him and Michael rarely saw eye to eye. They argued passionately. Our group never believed in living within the constraints of societal norms, and we were up at all hours. We came and went as we pleased, embracing freedoms, and listened to music as we did introspective work." Terry shoved the kids further behind her and snapped, infuriated. "You were a group of entitled, bratty hippies following some middle-aged, mentally ill twat. Listen to yourself. The stereotypical cultish drivel coming out of your mouth right now," Terry cried. I was shocked at her outburst, although I couldn't have agreed more. It did sound like cultish drivel. It made me so angry that this was what an entire floor of people died over. As Terry ended her rant, the curtains hanging on the window behind her burst into flames. I jumped and felt my heart skip a beat. "Don't insult us. I'm sick of hearing simple-minded people call us a cult," came from the back row. An average-looking man with dark hair and jeans had piped up, smiling and watching the curtains burn. He had done that. They were all capable of what Natalia had done to Georgia at the very least. For the first time since the people had entered Terry's flat, my nerves of steel had wavered. I realized that we were only alive because they were allowing it so far. We were in big trouble. Terry swiftly shut up and Natalia continued her story. Michael was the true leader. Not like all the fakes you hear of in the news. The people you're talking about. He was teaching us to build a world of peace and harmony. But he didn't deny that in order to do that you had to eradicate the non-believers. He taught us to embrace the bad in us. Harness it so that we could do extraordinary things. She smiled wickedly as her hands glowed hot coals as she spoke. It may have sounded like cultish drivel, but Michael, being a total faker, wouldn't explain their powers. Things went wrong when someone went to the police after Michael and Jonathan had a terrible argument one night. When the police arrived, Jonathan told us to go. The group had been planning to leave this building anyway. We'd had nothing but interruption and trouble in our time here. This place is weird. But we had nowhere immediate to go. The police already disliked us after overcrowding the last property. We didn't need any more attention. Michael was furious. We brainstormed in a field for hours who could have done it. I personally suspected the next-door neighbor, Mavis. The woman was so nosy, always knocking and asking us to keep noise down, interrupting our spiritual sessions. Michael couldn't make a certain judgment on the person who had done it. All we thought we were sure of was that they had to be on the same floor. So he instructed us to go back that night and eradicate the whole floor and every non-believer who lived there. As you know, we obliged this incited sick laughter from the crowd. I waited, forcing myself to let her finish, buying time. We took pleasure in their screams, in watching every man, woman, and child go up in flames through their front door windows. It was the first time we'd unleashed all that energy, and we felt so powerful. But then, as we left the burning hallway behind us and entered the stairwell, this building found a way to over one more time. I couldn't give you a number on the amount of times we tried to run down those stairs, leave our glorious victory behind us, and return to Michael. It didn't matter how many times we tried. We couldn't make it past that floor. The stairs wouldn't let us. It didn't take long before the fire reached the stairwell we were trapped in, burning us all, along with the non-believers. We died just in time for the fire engine to arrive. We may have been dead, but we didn't disappear. We couldn't leave the building. We were stuck just wandering it. In and out of the burned flats and hallways, but not allowed anywhere else unless we were asked. It was awful. We didn't try to cause any trouble at first. We waited for Michiel to come and find us, instruct us. 2 months passed and he hadn't come. Instead came confirmation. A newspaper put through the door of the building. Headline news. Tower Block resident Bernie Hemmings information vital to imprisonment of local cult leader on drug charges. I gasped. I couldn't believe I hadn't found that when I was researching Prue, but I suppose local news wasn't so heavily online back then. Natalia saw my shocked expression and grinned wider than before. The old bat didn't tell you that, then she asked, although it wasn't really a question, that her stupid husband is the whole reason we're here. We started to really cause issues then. Did anything within our power to f the whole building over. But it didn't take them long to work out that we had to be asked to come in. We only stopped when Prue worked out a way we could die a second time. And that we won't come back again. She killed 2 of our group. She was the only person that could stop us. We couldn't do shit with her around. We stopped and reached a stalemate. Then she moved out. We were going to honor that stalemate. Until you stabbed me. Prue's gone. It's fair game in here. Now. As Natalia got angrier, a member of her group started getting agitated. They all soon followed like a hive mind, working as one. The stillness became chaotic, with all of them moving and making noise. I didn't notice at first when one started walking towards Terry and the kids, but I noticed when it got near. It was a teen girl, slender and pretty, but still unsettlingly average. As she got within a meter of the family, Ellie suddenly went rigid. The claws that replaced her fingernails grew longer and sharper, with jagged edges from growing so fast. The voids deepened, if that was even possible. She opened her mouth to reveal rows of sharp teeth, blood-caked where the tooth meets the gum where they had grown too quickly as well. Ellie jumped. She reached out towards the girl and slashed her face with the claws, leaving deep gouges across her eyes. She clung on to the girl, using her claws as wall pegs, keeping herself at eye level. Eddie controlled the crowd. His own claws grew and he ran towards them, sending them scattering out of the flat. Random bursts of flames erupted everywhere, lighting up the whole room. Shit had hit the fan. The two demon children were successfully fending off a group of 15 dead superhuman cultists. Natalia ran from them too, but kept her eyes locked on mine as she did. As she ran from the flat, she spoke to me. "This isn't over," she screamed, and I knew that it wasn't. I stayed on Terry's sofa that night. We organized all the burned items in the house and threw things out before we crashed out in the early hours. The kids' claws retracted and they returned to their earlier state, causing mischief in the hallways. They were too young to really understand. I didn't sleep much. Nothing new. When I woke up, Terry was still asleep. I didn't want to disturb her, so I walked back to my flat, desperate to avoid anything strange on my way. The stairs must have noticed, because they didn't skip on my way up. I hadn't checked the time when I left Terry's, but I reached my door at the same time as a familiar face. Postman Ian was stood there, dropping letters on my doorstep. "Hey, love," he shouted as he noticed me. "I need to talk. Can you come inside? Just 5 minutes. Please," I practically begged him at the doorstep. I told him everything that had happened the night before. How Natalia was out for revenge and I was the object of her rage. I begged him to tell me how to kill them, but he claimed he didn't know. He said if kept my doors locked and didn't let them in, then I'd be fine. He looked shirty as I mentioned killing them. Didn't even suggest asking Prudence how to do it. Something was telling me there wasn't much point. He seemed so disingenuous. I wanted to trust him. So badly I wanted to trust him. I had been so vulnerable with him over Jamie. But if Prudence Hemmings could forget to mention what Bernie had done, and conveniently never pass on the method to kill these awful people, leaving them around to terrorize her friends and neighbors, then could she be a liar too? Could I really trust Ian? When he provided no answers and no real help, something inside me told me that I needed to get him out of my flat. I needed to rethink, start working things out on my own. I made excuses to Ian and sent him on his rounds. Prudence left me these rules, but she left so much out. How do I know I wasn't always a pawn in some sick game? Her fantasy life as a puppet master, setting me up to fail. She's kept her granddaughter in a cage for years. Maybe she enjoys suffering. I wasn't going to give up easily, though. Natalia wasn't going to win. I decided then and there that I needed to attend the committee meeting today and start building an army against Natalia. I didn't need Prue's help or her methods. With enough manpower, I could do it myself. This was war. I sat all morning thinking about everything, cup after cup of coffee in front of me to keep me awake. Once the postman had left and I was alone with my thoughts, they just continued to get louder. I thought about Natalia and the cult, about the kids and their nighttime antics, about the committee meeting, Jamie and how much I missed him, Georgia and my burning guilt, and Mr. Prentice, who was finally making those aforementioned animal noises. Most of all, I thought about the note left for me on move-in day, how it had changed everything. My whole life was different now. I was alone, and it felt like my new home was attacking from every angle. I reread the note a few times over my coffee. I worried about my rent. It was tight but manageable. School is currently out in the UK, but as a training teacher assigned to a school, I still get paid a small amount through the summer. The rent is low, and with a second summer job I can just about make it without Jamie. It sounds strange, but it felt nice to worry about something normal for a minute, even if I should have been worrying about my survival and the many entities currently trying to kill me. I didn't get to stew for too long. I had to get ready for the committee meeting. After the events of the night before and my growing mistrust of Prudence, it was imperative that I got the neighbors on side if I was going to achieve anything like my goals of eradicating the imposter or cultist neighbors. The meeting was at noon in flat 31. There was a poster on a communal notice board by the entrance that I was glad to spot. Terry hadn't mentioned the time when we met in all our meetings, since it had been a bit hectic to discuss it. The poster promised tea and cakes, and my stomach rumbled at the thought. I hadn't eaten properly in days. At 11:55, I left the flat and wandered out into the corridor. I'd never seen so many neighbors. Mr. Prentice, however, was still making that awful noise, and I watched in disbelief as every single person in the corridor walked past his door, as if it was silent. I did my usual deliberation on whether to take the stairs or lift, but yet again the stairs won. I still couldn't bear being where Jamie died, and all these extra flights were keeping me fit. Flat 31 belonged to an older lady named Molly Thompson and her husband Eric. She had a blue rinsed head of curls attached to her head and had gone to the effort to make homemade Battenberg cake. Other neighbors had bought along baked goods as well. It reminded me of a school fair. The flat itself was decorated for the 70s, with plenty of china cat ornaments littered around. I sat down on a dusty plastic garden chair, one of many that Molly seemed to have acquired and laid out for the residents pouring in. I hadn't seen community spirit like this in my life. I smiled as I saw Terry, Eddie, and Ellie wander in. It was nice to see some familiar faces. I had noticed people looking at me, wondering who I was. It probably wasn't often they got new neighbors. Eddie came running up to me, swung his arms around me, and sat down in the rickety garden chair next to mine. It was so sweet. Terry smiled at me and took a seat the other side of mine. Ellie sat next to her brother. The brown puppy dog eyes were back. No claws. "I'm glad you came," Terry said to me, loud enough to hear over the voices of the other neighbors. "I really want you to see the good side of the block. We don't bite, really," she laughed nervously as she realized the irony of her statement. "Terry, I need help. We need to stop those people from coming back again and from terrorizing people. The block can't go on like this." I wanted to make the purpose of my attendance clear to her. It was time for things to change. "But if you don't let them in, then they don't bother you. I've spoken to the kids. They know not to do it again. That those people are dangerous." She paused for a moment and sighed. Although them running away didn't help. The kids think they're indestructible now. They've been telling me all morning that they're going to kill the bad guys. She looked so resigned. But it was true, they did run away from the twins. Maybe there was something in that. I knew they could die, I just had to work out how. But as the thought crossed my mind and I looked at Eddie and Ellie, I couldn't imagine taking the risk. I could have flat out gone back and asked Prudence. But to be honest, I didn't want anything to do with her. She gave me such a bad feeling. I was doubting everything she told me. It doesn't matter if you can keep them away. We can't all live in fear. Yours aren't the only kids in this building. I knew this from surveying the room. But I bet not all the kids here are as special as yours. What if another family burns to death because their kids were hyper one night? I could see this struck a chord with Terry. She looked at me with glassy eyes as if on the verge of tears. "You're right. Molly's the chairwoman and she can be a little strict, but you can bring it up under any other business." She spoke with a lump in her throat. "Here you go." By the way, she handed me a piece of printed paper. Any other business felt a bit lackluster, but it would do, as long as it got discussed. I turned my attention to the piece of paper. It was the agenda for the meeting. For something written so formally, it appeared farcical. It seemed other flats and floors had different but equally strange issues to mine. There were only 6 items on the agenda for the meeting with AOB as the 7th. They were as follows. 1. Welcome and introductions with apologies for absence. 2. Replacing of the flickering lights on floor 11. It seems to incite vicious behavior from the pets and elderly of that floor. 3. Serving a formal residence letter of concern to the man who doesn't move from the bottom of the stairwell on floor 5. 4. Finances budgets for general maintenance and the annual barbecue. 5. The stairs with no grip leading up to floor 14 at the very top and the health and safety hazards this presence. 6. Soundproofing of Mr. Prentice's flat, number 48. I was comforted to know that I wasn't alone in dealing with all these strange occurrences. I was also chilled to the core to know for certain that it was the entire building that was more than a bit odd. What really struck me as odd is that when I thought about it, I had seen that man on floor 5 when going down the stairs, but I'd never noticed that it had been every time, or that he had never moved, until this moment. The meeting begun with a loud and dissatisfying clink. By this point, the tiny 70s-themed flat was packed. Garden chairs had all ran out and people were standing. Molly Thompson stood up from her floral-patterned armchair and bashed a teaspoon against the outside of her cup. She reminded me of a very strict disciplinarian school teacher I had worked with during my university placement. She commanded quiet in the room. "I think we should get started, everyone," she shrilled, her voice growing louder with every word until the crowd came to a silent hum. "Right, firstly, we are not going to skip the introductions today. Apologies have been given by Joe and Steph of Flat 2 and yet again by Mr. Prentice. We have a new face in the room, as I'm sure many of you have noticed." She gestured to me and looked in my direction but didn't really make any eye contact. She was just talking about me as I sat in the room. Eventually, she addressed me directly. "Stand up, dear. Introduce yourself. We're pleased to have you here." I was deeply uncomfortable. I could feel some sort of panic coming on. I never liked standing in crowds very much. But I stood up anyway. Hi. My name is Kat. I live in flat number 42. I moved in with my boyfriend Jamie, but he was killed in the lift by the weird rat creatures you people have living here. The people that claim to live in the burned-out flats won't leave me alone, and one in particular seems to want me dead. Oh. And that window cleaner outside my flat makes me want to scoop my own eyes out with a spoon every time he knocks on the door. "Nice to meet you all," the crowd had gasped a little. I sat down. Instantly mortified, I don't know what happened. The normality and structure of the meeting overwhelmed me. There's something about a sense of order and normality amongst chaos. It does something to your brain, and for me, for the first time in this whole journey, it sent me into a meltdown. I sobbed as I hit the chair, both in pure mental exhaustion and disappointment that I had blown my chance at building any sort of army against Natalia. Terry rubbed my shoulder. Molly broke the awkward silence that had blanketed the room. "Nice to meet you, Catherine. I understand life in this building can be a little overwhelming. We did ask the previous occupant to let us intervene when you moved in, but she was insistent. In hindsight, we may need to review our policies on new tenants. I am so very sorry for the loss of your partner. The lift is a most unfortunate situation." She had been in positions of power in her life for certain. She responded professionally but coldly. There was no feeling in her condolences. She came off like a corrupt politician digging themselves out of a hole. She did decide to skip the introductions after my outburst. I also hate it when I'm called Catherine. My parents named me Katie and I shorten it to Kat. Her presuming it was Catherine added to her school teacher demeanor. She carried on with the proceedings pretty swiftly, and interesting characters present at the meeting started to emerge. My favorite was a large, middle-aged Caribbean woman named Precious St. Fleur, who would not accept Molly's claims that there was not enough in the budget to replace the lighting on floor 11. She got up and lifted her shirt to reveal a large, deep bite mark across her stomach caused by her dog after a long episode of the lights flickering. When that didn't change Molly's answer, she lifted her trouser leg to reveal a smaller, but still noteworthy bite mark on her leg, from her elderly mother who lives with her. Molly didn't budge. It took what felt like an eternity to get to any other business. If I weren't so focused on my goal, I would have enjoyed hearing about the quirks of the other floors. Maybe tried to engage a little, but I just couldn't concentrate. When the chairwoman asked if anyone had any other business, she scanned the room quickly. I stood up from my chair and she locked in on me with her eyes. My hands were shaking, and I could feel a cold sweat forming all over my body. "Catherine, what can we help you with, dear?" she asked in a patronizing tone. "I want help in getting rid of the people pretending to be from the burned-out flats. I can't be the only person that doesn't like living in fear," I stated boldly, trying not to break down again. "Dear, we have had this discussion multiple times and it's been taken off the agenda. I am aware you're new here, but there is nothing we can do about certain problems within this building. And for this particular issue, we would appreciate you not letting them into your home and ignoring them like the rest of us," she snapped back. "But that's not good enough. Terry's kids answered the door last night, they're children. It's easily done. What if someone else's child does it and aren't so lucky to survive? One burned my friend so bad a few nights ago that she's still unconscious in hospital. This I knew from social media." A few people called out in agreement with me from the crowd. The only one who has ever been able to deal with them is Prudence. And that difficult woman never revealed her methods. "Don't think we didn't try. You're suggesting a suicide mission. You do well to remember you are new here." Molly hissed through her teeth. Did she have to mention I was new so many times? It was grating on me. "Well, I'm willing," shouted Precious. She seemed stronger than the rest in her earlier rant. I was glad to have her on side. Where she came forward, a few others followed. Soon I had 5 people plus myself willing to form a subcommittee to get rid of the cultists. Molly didn't like it, but she agreed to let us do it. There was me, Precious, and Terry, along with a lady named Shanti, who lived a few doors from me. A man named Anton and his friend Leo from floor 8 made up the group. To be honest, they just seemed keen to get involved with any kind of battle. Leo was the loud one. Anton was mostly silent. I invited them to my flat after Molly swiftly adjourned the meeting. Inviting anyone into my home made me anxious now. I found myself studying each of their faces to ensure they weren't too average and I hadn't invited the wrong people in. I was fairly certain I hadn't. Eddie and Ellie settled in front of my TV in the bedroom so they didn't hear our conversation. They may only be kids, but I felt safer with them there. We discussed for hours how we could bring the imposter people into one place and kill them all. Leo was particularly creative. He came up with weird and wacky ways to end them, from locking them in a room and blasting with fire extinguishers until they freeze, to herding them into the lift between 1:11 and 3:33 a.m. The whole time I waited nervously for a knock on the door for them to come for us. But they didn't. We got time to plan. But despite the time it never really took off, no idea seemed feasible. I shared everything I knew. My conversation with Prue, the night before in Terry's flat. Everything. Precious listened to my tales intently before speaking. Derek would have helped us. He was a great man. He used to turn up at my door in the dead of the night, just as those lights started, and take my dog for a walk. She spoke of the gardener with a fondness. Prudence told me about Derek. She said he's been gone since the garden was demolished, I replied flatly. It was awful when he left. That woman that used to live here was nasty to him. I watched out my window as she tore up the garden. I know she was grieving for that little girl, but I know Derek only ever wanted to help. Shanti spoke up from the corner. She had been pretty quiet the whole time. He was the whole reason we don't have those awful creatures from the lift all over our homes anymore. My brother was killed by one before the agreement. He was 4 years old. I twitched as she told her story. Shanti has such sad eyes, and speaking about her brother only filled them further with sadness. This is another thing I don't understand. Why have any agreement? If you managed to kill most of them, why not all? I asked, feeling anger over Jamie burn through my throat as I spoke. Precious laughed. Terry shot her a look from across the room. No one's told you the whole story, have they? Shanti asked, a single tear running down her face. What do you mean? This was driving me insane. Nothing was simple. How could I trust anyone? When Prudence and some of the others killed the creatures, they killed a large group of them in one hit. They had started to work out that food scraps and pet food were attracting them, and they gathered all the pet food in the tower block into one empty flat on the floor the fire had happened. The creatures came in droves, just like expected, and they set the flat alight. Again. The flat was burned to ash on top of pre-existing ash. Nothing could survive that. Shanti was interrupted after this by Leo. And then 3 giant rat mothers literally rose from the ashes, triple as smart and strong. Shit up, he said, a look of excitement on his face. Shanti rolled her eyes and continued. So all Prudence did was cause a quite literally bigger problem. She didn't kill them. All she did was help them evolve. There was only 3 of them, but they learned to sneak attack. More people died than during the original infestation. They were more intelligent, but not in the way it comes across when the agreement's spoken about. We couldn't speak to or reason with them. Terry was looking at the floor. Only Derek was able to do that. He spoke to them like he spoke to the garden. He made it safe for everyone again. I wasn't there. I was too young, but there we were told he didn't even have to use words. They understood just a series of movements and eye contact. Derek explained the rule with the lift. He told us it was a gesture of goodwill. The creatures needed a home and seemed attracted to the building, and we would let them live there and stop killing their kind if they would stop killing ours. But to show them some respect, we would allow them a small time frame where unleash their instinctual nature, but only if someone came to them. There are only 2 left now. Prudence killed the other during what happened with her granddaughter, but that only made them 2 stronger, like they absorbed the third. I tried to take in all the information I was receiving, but I couldn't. It was too much. Derek isn't coming back. It's been years. This is pointless, Terry finally erupted. Precious laughed again. How do you know? You speak to dear old Prue all the time. Know something we don't? Precious spoke sarcastically, but I think she meant what she said. It was becoming clear that Prudence Hemmings wasn't too popular in this building. I don't speak to her all the time. We just keep in contact. She was always nice to me. Terry tried weakly to defend herself. That's because you're naive and a pushover. She used you because no one else would give her the time of day. Precious was about to launch into a full rant on Terry. I was glad Eddie and Ellie were in the other room and couldn't hear. I wondered if she'd seen them at night. I decided to stop the rant. This was becoming counterproductive, and we were getting nowhere with our plans. I interjected and told them all I needed them to leave so that I could sleep. Partly true, although I knew I couldn't sleep. I had other things to do. They all filed out of my flat. Terry and the kids were the last to leave. She gave me a hug as she left and told me to get a proper night's rest, telling me she was always there for a cuppa and a chat. It was sweet. I felt sorry for Terry. The kids hugged me too as they left. I know she spoke to Prue, but I was certain that it really was entirely innocent. I sat in the empty flat disheartened that my assembling of an army had turned into a bickering shit show with no real suggestions on how to kill the imposter neighbors. I felt totally alone. I couldn't trust Prue or Ian, or pretty much anything I thought I knew. Maybe Prue didn't even kill those neighbors. They only told me half-truths about the creatures after all. I was left alone with my thoughts again, and after a few hours, A good one finally struck me, but I needed supplies. I left the building and went to the nearest shop to gather the items I needed. For what I needed, and the time of night I had to travel to a 24-hour supermarket. It took half-hour each way on the bus, but I stayed focused. My bags were heavy and awkward on the way back to the block, but if it paid off, this was going to be worth it. I trudged up the stairs. It took me 2 trips and 24 flights of stairs instead of 14 to get everything in my flat and organize myself. It only took 16 in a large gym bag that was much easier to carry on the way back down, thankfully. I passed the man on floor 5 twice. Now I'd noticed him. He made my skin crawl a little. I walked through the downstairs corridor, diverting away from the main entrance and passing all the ground floor flats to the door at the back of the building. The door at the back led to a small concrete area with a grass strip along the side and a bench decorated with a memorial plaque. This was the block's outside space. As is typical in the city, the whole bench was covered in graffiti. The memorial was unreadable. I got to work. I dug the strip of grass, turning soil with my new equipment. I had never been green-fingered, and to be honest, the shrubs I had bought had been so heavy I had grown to resent them a little. I worked for an hour and a half. I was sweating and night had come. It was pitch black, and I was using my phone torch to see. I had almost given up until I got up from my crouching position to stretch my knees. I reached my arms out, put down my shovel, and took a seat on the bench. I hadn't seen him arrive, but the man was already sat there. He wore a flat cap and a jacket, despite it being the middle of summer and a beautiful night. He just smiled warmly at the shrubs for a moment without a word. Eventually he spoke. "I've missed this place. Name's Derek." I sat silent for a moment in shock that my plan had even worked. It seemed almost too simple, too easy. But here he was. Derek had a kindly face. Wrinkles around his eyes and cheeks only added to the softness of his expression. His white hair poking out from beneath his flat cap stood out in the dark night. "That's a lovely little patch you've planted. I can look after it if you like. I used to maintain the last garden here," he said, breaking the silence that had followed since his initial words. "I know who you are. We need you was all I could manage." The mental exhaustion and fatigue from the whole experience had built up, but his arrival was like finishing a bad day working at school. I felt like I could relax again, even if only a little. "What's your name, darling?" he asked. "It's Kat. I live in flat 42 now." His face lit up as I confirmed my flat number. "Prudence has gone?" he asked. "She's gone. But the whole place is a mess. So many things are happening, and the residents are suffering," I answered. We chatted for what felt like hours. Outside with nothing but moonlight, he told me how he used to consider the building part of the garden, a place for him to maintain the residents just like the plants he looks after. I explained my whole experience since moving in. I told him about Jamie and I sobbed. Derek held me as I cried and made me feel safe. Something I had forgotten the feeling of since receiving Prue's note. He didn't interrupt, he just listened. I told him about Natalia and the cultists, the problems they had been causing. He was particularly heartbroken when he heard that they had used Eddie and Ellie for entry. He had gone before they were born, but remembered Terry as a child and how sweet she was. He was pleased when I told her what a sweet adult she had become. My claims that Prudence was the only person who knew how to kill the imposter neighbors were met with a skeptical expression which gave me some hope. Derek listened to my entire tale with barely a word. When I finished, he stood up and asked me to follow him. I was confused, but I did as I was told. He walked me to the entrance of the lift. I lifted my arm to check the time on my watch. We had been outside for quite some time, and the idea of the creatures being inside made my heart pound and my stomach turn. "You are safe. It's 12:32 a.m. There's no need to worry or to check your watch," and with that he pressed the call lift button. Despite his insistence that I was safe, my stomach continued to do gymnastics. It felt like forever before the lift finally made the clunking sound that meant it had reached the bottom. I felt my whole body shaking violently as the doors opened. I don't know what I expected to see. We were in the safe time zone, but every time I looked at the life I pictured Jamie's dead, crunched-up body. "Step inside," he said. "I can't. Please don't make me," I begged. "I won't let anything happen to you. But you need to see something." There was such sincerity in his eyes as he spoke. I had never trusted someone so completely so quickly, but every fiber of my being told me this man was entirely good. I stepped inside the lift. Derek stepped in behind me, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder as I hyperventilated. He gently turned me to face the panel of buttons that control where the lift stops. "What is wrong with this panel?" "Do you see it?" he asked cryptically. I studied the panel, read all the numbers, counting them. I couldn't see anything wrong. I really tried, but nothing seemed out of place at all. Everything you expected to find was there and nothing more. I shook my head, barely regaining my composure. "Can you take us to floor 9, please?" He smiled slightly as he made the request. I looked back to the panel to press the button, but floor 9 didn't exist. I was so confused. I had counted the numbers. I was sure of it. Derek must have made it disappear. But the panel didn't look any different to before. I can't explain it. Looking at it, I would have sworn blind nothing was wrong with it, even once I knew, but floor 9 didn't exist. Derek could see my frustration. It was like the building was now playing tricks on me. He walked me out of the lift and sat me down on the bottom of the stairs before he finally began to speak. "The building is like a living organism. It can seal off parts of the world, and it can open up others you never could have imagined. When those awful people burned that whole floor of residence, I was devastated. Some wonderful people lived in those flats, both of the usual and unusual variety. But those people had no limit to their cruelty. Whole families burned alive. It was a tragedy that made me so angry. I felt so guilty when it happened. I can predict what some of our more tricky residents are going to do and make sure I'm there to help. But those people were nothing to do with this place. I couldn't see what they were planning, so I couldn't stop it." At this point, I noticed one of the hairless cats had sat between us. Derek looked at it with tears brimming in his eyes. He stroked it and it moved onto his lap. Derek's fingers didn't burn at all. He continued. "When it happened, the building used its defense mechanisms and sealed off the entirety of the floor. It stopped the fire from spreading and kept the perpetrators there, to die by their own hands. The building only allowed the floor to be unsealed once they were dead. It took about a week before those awful people turned up again, asking for sugar at people's doors the first few let them in. It was so difficult. So many residents burned alive that I was having to use their remains for my garden just to hide the dead. The entire community were terrified and grieving for those that died. No matter how hard I tried, I still couldn't predict them or see them, so I took Prudence, who at the time seemed a perfectly reasonable woman, to the burned-out floor. Floor 9, however, had been sealed again. There was no button in the lift, and it always skipped on the stairs. Only no one had noticed. This building really is a magnificent creature." I stared at him in amazement through the whole story. I was exhausted, but my brain was working in overdrive to process what he was telling me. I had started to stroke the cat too. My fingers did burn, but I didn't flinch. I found its company comforting. He carried on. I went back later that night and took the stairs again, alone this time. I think my intentions were clear, and the stairs allowed me access to floor 9 for the first time since just after the fire. I brought Prudence to the floor within the hour. The stairs had stopped skipping floor 9 for me, although I later learned that when Prudence had tried alone, she was not allowed access. We explored the floor, walking amongst the remnants of our dead friends' belongings. Eventually, we came across one of the soulless arsonists roaming the halls. It appears that's where they spend their time when they aren't out terrorizing the residents trying to claim more victims. He was disturbed and disoriented to see anyone not like them on that floor. He twitched a little and spat out the sugar line as if it was an automatic response. I almost felt sorry for him. He claimed to come from flat 66. More were approaching behind him. Prudence was terrified. She was starting to sweat profusely and back away from the man. But it didn't cool her down. He was burning her slowly. I felt nothing see. The stranger things in life just don't seem to affect me. I've never known why. Sometimes I even just know how to deal with them. Like it's programmed into me. On this new playing field in their domain, I knew what to do. I grabbed the man and ran him down to flat 66, 4 doors from where we were standing. I threw him into the flat and waited. The other arsonists were approaching. The man tried to exit the flat, that was doorless after the wooden doors all burned to cinders in the fire. But as he reached to door, something stopped him. He couldn't leave, no matter how hard he tried or how much he screamed. Prudence lit up. She grabbed hold of one that had tried to kill her friend, Molly. She remembered the flat number she had claimed to be from and repeated my actions, with a lot more sweating and some winces of pain. It worked again. Prudence wanted to go after the rest, but as they got closer I could see the blisters forming on parts of her body. I dragged her out of the hallway and back into the stairwell. We ran. She begged me to take her back, kept telling me that the stairs wouldn't let her, that it was too dangerous. The residents had started to learn not to let them in, and we had no casualties at all after we trapped the first 2. Don't get me wrong, it's a problem I was intending to deal with. But it was around that time that we first learned the council would be building that monstrosity over the top of my garden. He gestured to the window that just showed some of the neighboring tower block. This left me not at my best. My intuition was failing me when a few months after that, I allowed Prudence and Molly to herd the creatures from the lift to floor 9. It's one of my biggest regrets. I should never have walked them up there. But I didn't know she was going to burn them all. She didn't give me a chance to reason. I became mistrusting of everyone and distracted. Not long after I went away for a long while. So I guess the arsonists remained and now they're threatening you. Tomorrow I will go. I will fix the mess I left behind. I am so sorry it's affected you so badly. I'd love to meet these twins. They sound incredibly brave. I finally interrupted, and I want to be there tomorrow. I want to lock Natalia away for good. I can't allow it. You'll be attacked. He cut me off entirely. I let it drop instantly, but in the back of my mind I knew I would be there, no matter what. I went to sleep that night with my mind reeling. I wondered where Derek slept, and if he even needed to. The next morning I left my flat early, past the man on floor 5, and waited on the steps at floor 8. I tested it, of course, and just like anticipated, ascending any higher took me straight to floor 10, or 11, depending on if you hit a skip. So I returned to floor 8, and I waited. Derek hadn't indicated what time he was coming, but I was ready. I would wait all day and night if I had to, but luckily I didn't. Derek was climbing the stairs at around 11 a.m. I had already been there for 3 hours, but it had been worth it. He looked particularly unimpressed to see me. His face still looked kind, though, even with the sour expression. "I can't stop you, can I?" he sighed, sounding resigned in his tone. "Not for anything. You have to promise to stay back. If you get your girl approaches, you can do what you need to do, but you have to stay back," he pleaded. I nodded and stood up. We ascended the stairs, and for the very first time in my new life here I saw the big plastic sign saying 9, the floor that didn't exist. As we pushed through the door, it was like entering an entirely new world. Everything was black, burned to carbon. You could smell nothing but charcoal. Literally nothing but empty shells of homes and flakes of what used to be sentimental objects remained. It was devastating to witness. If you've ever visited a mass grave site, you'll understand partly how I was feeling. It was sickening to think of all the lives needlessly lost. But I didn't get time to think. Natalia walked towards me, flying down the hallway. "How did you get here?" she screamed. Her eyes were wide and angry. I started to feel hotter already. Derek grabbed my arm and pulled me next to him, making sure to keep a tight hold of my arm. "Where do you live?" Derek asked her. I started to back away as the sweat dropped from my brow. I desperately wanted to shout out the number, but I couldn't. I was so hot. I wasn't functioning properly. Everything became so overwhelming I couldn't remember what Georgia had said, what flat Natalia had claimed to come from. I'm not that stupid. I saw what happened to them. She gestured over her shoulder to what must have been flat number 66, where a man laid on the floor, breathing but looking broken, just existing in that room. Prudence had been creative with the truth yet again. She didn't kill them. You can't kill them. What had Georgia said? I racked my brains as I felt the skin on my face start to sting. I imagined her melting away. It was happening to me. I was next. And then, as my hair started to singe at the ends, it came to me. 71, I screamed as loud as I could. I could barely see as Derek grabbed her and ran towards me with her. She was clawing at his eyes and face, screaming at him to let go. But he didn't burn. He just kept hold of her. When he approached flat 71, he beckoned me over. "You do it. Then get off of this floor." He was blunt but reasonable. I complied. I pushed hard. There was nothing but anger in her eyes. She pushed my face hard with her hand as I got her to cross the boundary into flat 71. I felt my skin sizzle and blister. My whole face was in agony, but I didn't stop pushing. Watching Natalia try to fight her way out of a door that didn't exist was both satisfying and humorous. The others had started to approach at the sound of the commotion. I lingered, hoping to watch her suffer, but Derek shot me one look, and I knew. It was time to go. I ran out the corridor and back into the stairwell. I stopped for longer than I probably should have, but I knew I might not get to see that 9 again, and it would be worth it. I waited for Derek on floor 9 stairwell. I couldn't help but imagine the cultist burning to death the first time around. I could hear angry screams faintly from inside the corridor. They made me worry about Derek, but I knew that really I didn't need to. It took a while, but he eventually left the corridor and joined me in the stairwell. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, and the third-degree burns across my face. He didn't need to speak. I knew he'd fix the problem. We walked silently back down the stairs towards my flat. I looked back up at floor 9, knowing the building would seal it off for good. It took a few floors to reach floor 7, and I invited Derek in for a cup of tea. He rejected it, saying he wanted to go visit some old friends. Despite my injuries, I couldn't help but smile. Something I'd done was going to help these residents. I stood at my door and watched Derek walk away, pleased that there was some true good in this building. After a few steps down the hallway, Derek started to fade, almost like a CGI ghost in a movie. Every step he became more transparent. I felt my stomach turn again, like it had outside the lift. I ran out to follow him. I called after him, but by the time I had reached where he'd been, he was gone. I walked the entire corridor to the window at the back. I looked out the window into the small concrete heavy garden and hoped to see him sat on the memorial bench. I didn't see him. Instead, I saw Prudence, hacking at my tiny planted patch with shears. When I saw her out the window, garden shears being gripped by both hands and a maniacal expression on her face, I just stood still. I was frozen to the spot in shock. I felt no pain at all from the burn on my face. Everything was numb. The relief of eradicating the imposter neighbors, and the joy at finding a friend in Derek was hacked away in an instant. Just like every leaf from my shrubs. Why would she do this? What had I ever done to her? Every question possible crossed my mind. I could feel the frustration bubbling inside me. Everything about this place just threw up question after question. And for every answer I got, there were 10 new questions waiting to be asked. At that moment in time, though, only one was truly important. How did Prudence know? I thought about Terry and her telephone conversations. I didn't want to think that the sweet lady I thought Terry had turned out to be would do that, but it did cross my mind. I thought of Ian the postman. I'd had bad vibes from him for a while. Maybe he'd seen Derek coming up the stairs while on his rounds that morning. I stood there frozen pondering all these things until I saw Prudence collapse onto the memorial bench sobbing, head in her hands. She was surrounded by the remains of my attempt at a garden with the shears laid out on the floor. The stairs were kind to me on the way down. It took 4 flights to make it to the bottom. I ran down the corridor and out the back entrance of the block. No idea what I was going to say. Prudence was all I could manage. Nice one, Cat. She sat bolt upright before turning and standing quicker than I thought it possible for an old lady. You evil, stupid little girl. Do you have any idea what you've done? She screamed, so much animation in her face that the spaces between her wrinkles pulsated like veins on an angry weightlifter. Me. You think I'm evil. You left that shitty note hidden, missing everything I need to know, and got my boyfriend killed. And what you're doing to your own, I screamed, tears beginning to roll, before she interrupted me. Don't you dare talk about her. Her voice cracked and she broke down again, this time falling to her knees, twigs and leaves sticking to the bottom of her dress. I didn't know what else to do, so I sat down on the floor. I knew that it was probably a bad idea. This woman couldn't be trusted, and I hadn't forgotten that. But seeing an old lady crying on the cement floor still made me feel awful. How did you know about the garden? I asked her calmly, trying to change my approach. She shoved a crumpled up piece of paper into my hand. She didn't look at me. Her eyes remained on the floor. Dear Prudence. I couldn't exist knowing what I'd done. I should never have told you about it. The last 2 won't grow stronger. She was never theirs to begin with. But I have to end her suffering. I'm sorry. Derek. I knew what he had done as soon as I finished the note. Lila, or what was left of her, was gone for good. Of all the creatures, only Jamie's killers from the lift remained. That's how Derek had spent the few hours I'd slept between our encounters. This is all your fault, she sniffed. My whole family are gone because of you. That hurt a lot. I trembled as I tried to speak, but I always really hated confrontation, and I could feel myself starting to glitch. How can you say that? I saw. Her and she was trapped in a tiny cage eating dog food and small animals. Your family died in that lift. Just like my Jamie, I may have struggled to get my words out, but I wasn't about to let Prudence Hemmings blame me for her decisions. Lila was better off dead than what she was, however awful that may sound. What happened to your face? Prudence growled at me. Take you to visit floor number 9. He did this to her in the first place, not me. And now he's disfigured you. She was spinning things. I could feel throbbing as she mentioned my face. I really should have had medical attention. This isn't his fault. You messed him up and he did that to her because of you. You told me that yourself. I tried ferociously to defend Derek, but something inside me still felt uncomfortable about what he had done. I couldn't help it. Lila was an innocent little girl who shouldn't have been punished for Prue's mistakes. This whole thing was such a mess. I was grieving. And then I had her back for all those years, and then I lost Bernie, and then my home, and now I have to grieve for her all over again. Prudence continued to cry, but softer. I looked around at the chaos she created and up at the block my boyfriend had died in and rolled my eyes in disbelief that she could be so selfish. She continued. Let me tell you about Lila. She was a beautiful little girl. As I mentioned before, I have two other older children. They've had many other grandchildren. However, I hadn't spoken to my eldest two in years, even before what happened with Lila. Lila was my first opportunity to get to know one of my grandchildren. Bernie adored her too, always reading her stories and sneaking her sweets. I begged my son to allow her to stay. My children were all incredibly ungrateful. They had it easy growing up and still resented me. I gave them a good, strict upbringing, but they didn't appreciate it. They said I was a cruel mother. Lila's dad was the only one I spoke to. But our relationship still wasn't that of a typical loving mother and son. But she was a second chance. It was a miracle when he agreed. I was more shocked he had convinced his wife to allow it. That awful harlot of a woman never liked me, although I didn't like her either. They refused to speak to me after everything. I haven't heard from them since. They had more grandchildren I'll never meet. I knew at the time my relationships with any of my children were over for good. So when Derek gave me a solution, I took it. I wasn't entirely truthful when we first spoke. I said I hadn't wanted this. But I was desperate. There was never a way to bring her back safely. Derek explained what she would become to me. He was initially trying to put me off even trying to get her back. I knew exactly what I was getting myself into. But I couldn't pass up the idea of my beautiful little Lila, meeting her grandma forever. I suppose I was too ashamed to admit it before. But why should I be ashamed? My altercation with Derek happened after she was back, when he tried to kill her the first time. Spouting the same things on that note. What kind of monster wants to kill a little girl? That's why I trashed the garden. He said he wasn't coping with the news of the new block when he suggested it. That he shouldn't have told me it was even possible and she had to die. I hid her until the bulldozers came in. When he disappeared, I thought I was safe to spend the rest of my life with her. Bernie hated me. Spending time with Lila was all I lived for. I grew to love her how she was. I felt sick. Listening to Prudence talk brought up so many repressed feelings about Jamie. I hadn't had time to grieve or process anything. I missed him terribly. My old life and my old future felt a million miles away. I was relieved to know that Derek hadn't tricked Prudence, or even intended to create Rat Lila. He was truly good. But she didn't get to have a life. You lived for her, but she wasn't really living. How could a sane person do that to their own flesh and blood? I retorted. You have no idea. This place can make you do irrational things, but she had a life. She had me. It's all she needed. She was certainly right about the building and irrational actions. The pain intensifying on my face throbbed in agreement. But I was still convinced she had lost it Dr. Frankenstein style where Rat Lila was concerned. She had stopped crying. Her rage levels were rising again. I tried to tell her that it wasn't really the child she'd known, but she seemed to have grown an entirely new attachment to the creature that replaced what she lost. Every rational argument I gave was met with increasing levels of screaming. She got less coherent as she went on. The argument was going nowhere. We went back and forth for what felt like forever. After a while, she started to get closer to me. We had both stood up by this point, and despite her haggard and frail appearance, Prudence was truly frightening. She looked unhinged. Her words were no longer going in. I was overwhelmed and had too many thoughts rushing through my mind to process her ranting. I took a few steps back, clearing a small distance between us. By this point, out of the corner of my eye, I could see neighbors and windows of the block. Watching the altercation outside, Prue's screaming had brought a lot of attention. It was bright and I couldn't see well, but I turned to scan the windows and did recognize Eddie and Ellie watching from their bedroom, trying to wave at me. They frantically waved and pointed. I tried waving back and gesturing to them, but they kept pointing at me. Why were they pointing? Then I heard it. The garden shears scraping against the ground as Prudence picked them up and charged towards me. You ignorant little bitch. You aren't even listening. You don't deserve my home. You killed her." The twins had been telling me to turn around. I shouldn't have taken my eyes off her. Luckily, unlike my earlier shock when I had first seen her, I didn't freeze. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in and I ran faster than I ever have before. I burst back into the building and heard neighbors on the bottom floor lock their doors and a symphony of bolts clicking. I couldn't blame them. Prudence wasn't far behind me, and I wouldn't want to take her on in her current state if given a choice. But it didn't stop me pounding on their doors, begging someone to call the police, although something told me that in this building that wasn't going to happen. I ran up the stairs, still being followed by her. By the second floor, most were still locked, but a few had come out of their homes, armed with a variety of heavy objects. That's the end of the story. If you have hooked up till here, then hit like button and comment down your views. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, then do support me by subscribing, so you may not miss any video in future.